Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Let's get caught up on where we are with Coastwatchers. A couple weeks ago, I had a business trip to Northern California. I drive. It's just what I do. I like to have the flexibility. Anyway, I was able to listen to a book on tape and do quite a bit of research on this subject. And oh my God, there is so much going on. It's an amazing story. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do it justice in this choose your own adventure style game, but I did write down a lot of notes and have quite a few ideas of how I want to do things. So what I have on the screen here is some of those thoughts and starting to put some structure to this design. One of the big components of why the Coastwatchers were successful was because of the relationship that they had with a number of the natives. Now there are many native tribes on these various islands, and having their help was, without it, none of this would have happened. Just that simple. And so from the research and listening to those, again, the books on tape, what I've kind of come up with is this native relationship idea or table that I'm designing around. So native relationships were critical to the success of the Coastwatcher program. And in doing my research, I'm going to set a scope of what those relationships that you'll have as a Coastwatcher with the natives. The broadest scope is at the island level. Okay, there may be multiple tribes on an island, and there may be an overall feel on the island as to what the relationship is with Coastwatchers versus the Japanese. Then there's individual tribes. In some cases, there were tribal wars going on in the middle of World War II on these islands. So Coastwatchers are trying to deal with getting support from some tribes while other tribes would be extremely hostile towards them. And then there was the personal level. And these were some of the individuals where they had made some real tight personal relationships. And so I thought this would be a good scope to set what I'm calling your relationship level. That can be either hostile, neutral, supportive, or loyal. And this may change as I get into the design and start working the system. So at any one time, you'll have events that will modify your current standing depending on the outcome of that event across all three levels. In a very general sense, these native tribes really didn't have a concept of the United States or allies against the Japanese, and would form their opinions based on what they saw. And strength was a huge factor in determining their relationships. Meaning they had been under, and some of them haven't been, but many had been under some sort of influence from the Allies, or the Australians specifically, and had no idea who the Japanese were. When the Japanese invaded and they showed that they had the strength, as it were, a number of these islands and the natives became helpful, supportive. I'm not sure about loyal, because everything I've read so far, the research has come from a Western point of view. There may have been some natives that were loyal to the Japanese as well. And it was really about strength. And so there were times where things would happen where the natives would make decisions based off of strength. Now, when the Japanese did some horrific things to the tribes, that would turn them against the Japanese. And for the most part, and when I say for the most part, I haven't heard or read, when I say heard, not like this is going around these days, right? Not that I've seen any research where the Coastwatchers worked against the tribes per se. in a horrific way that sometimes happen with the Japanese. So these relationships were very critical. Sometimes moving camp, the radio would take a dozen or more individuals to pick up the various components of the radio alone and move it. So when you're moving a lot of supplies and equipment, you need to have bodies to do that. And obviously, if you move from one camp to another, those people, those tribes, are going to know your location and could easily, and it has happened, disclose that location to the Japanese. And so an integral part of the game will be how you manage your native relationships, both good and bad. And so you may have a job or a mission, and it could be something as simple as picking up supplies that goes awry, or being ambushed by a Japanese patrol that doesn't go your way. These things will tip those relationships towards the Japanese, where when you have successful missions, you share your supplies. Things like that will move those relationships more in your favor. So this will get much further developed as I get into the actual gameplay. Another thing that I was thinking about is your individual, you as the Coastwatcher, traits. Now, this is just off the top of my head. I haven't worked these numbers yet, and I'm not sure how they're going to affect events and dice rolls and how that's going to affect gameplay. And these may change, but I've come up with 5. I don't want to do more than 5. 4 or 5 I think is optimal. Your surviving in these jungle environments is critical. Things can go from bad to worse if you don't know how to find food for yourself. If you don't have relations with the locals, you get separated from everybody during an ambush from the Japanese patrols, which has happened a number of times. So survival is key. Leadership, your ability to influence the natives in a positive way and organize them. Luck plays a big part in life in general, and there were many things that happened to these Coastwatchers that were just pure luck, or unlucky, as it were. Communication is both your ability to communicate your observations back to Ferdinand, but also your ability to communicate with the locals and get your points across. You may come up with a very good plan, but you're not able to communicate it very effectively with the locals, and that will affect your outcome. And then combat. This is going to have to, how do I put this? I'm going to abstract combat out, because there are times where your ability to lead the natives in combat, set up ambushes or defensive positions on how you defend against Japanese attacks, which happen at times. You had to have some sort of defensive perimeter, even if it was just to make an escape. And so you might have a 1v1 situation, and the combat score or rating needs to work on a tactical level as well as maybe a strategic level. Again, there was one Coastwatcher who basically had an area of an island mapped out that if the Japanese went into that area, which was near where his camp was, it was kind of a defensive perimeter where he went on the offensive and would actively go out and ambush the Japanese. Although that wasn't the Coastwatcher's job to do, this particular Coastwatcher, and I don't know what his parameter was, but if the Japanese came into those areas, he was much more offensive as opposed to maybe hiding or moving his camp. He was more of, I'm just going to go out and eliminate the threat. And so these are the 5. They may change by name And we'll see. I just put a number here, 1 to 5. This might be a dice roll modifier. I don't know what it's going to be, but that's just my initial thought, and we'll design off of that. So we've got our relationships. We got some traits to help us resolve events, and when we get into paragraphs, things that happen. Then I've started to block out a turn sequence. Weather is pretty important. If the weather is bad, visibility is lower, there's not as many opportunities to send information about a Japanese movement because the movement is limited, at least with aircraft. Now, ships still might be moving. You just have less of a chance to see them. I want to give you some agency. So I'm going to talk about 2 and 4 kind of together here. One of them is player agency. The other is random events. So the last thing I have on here is random event table, and I'll come up with 2 dozen types of events that randomly show up. And we'll talk about time as well here in just a second. For a turn, what's the time a turn takes, or this sequence triggers, right? But I also wanted to give you some player agency. So you may be in a situation where you're looking at your relationship with maybe a local tribe that's hostile or neutral towards you, and they know your location, so you might want to move your camp. There may be events that trigger that. You might want to spend this turn focusing more on your native relationships because it took work. And while you're doing that, sometimes you weren't able to scout or actively scout. And the more you could build up your native relationships and your networks, they would do some of the scouting and bring information back to you. And then active scouting. And what I mean by active scouting is you as a Coastwatcher are climbing the tree looking at what you're seeing. So this is more of personal, and this may, this might also involve the natives and your scouting network that you've set up. And then defensive actions against the Japanese. This is kind of what we talked about before. You're going to focus some of your time building up maybe an abstract number of what your defense is, so that minimizes your chance to be ambushed by Japanese patrols, for example. Again, these activities. I don't want a huge list. I think 5 is about right. 4 to 6. Right now I have 5, and these may change as I again do a little more research and things that you as a Coastwatcher might have a little more control over, right? And then, as I mentioned, that one Coastwatcher would go out and actively ambush Japanese patrols, and so offensive actions. Then I have what I say roll on the spotting table. There will be maybe some specific events that might be, come up on the random table that talk about what you actually were able to report back to Ferdinand on information gathered. And that's what I'm calling the spotting table. And that might be a report of 37 aircraft, 22 bombers. And those will have a victory point score. The more useful that information is, that affects a lot of things, right? That'll affect your native relationships. They want to be helpful, the ones that are helpful to you. And when they can see that you're being successful, that shows strength. Therefore, domino effect increases your relationships with them. Conversely, if you go a period of time and there's no activity on your part, that could work against you as well. And then a random events table. You roll to see stuff happens, right? So these are the 4 parts of the turn sequence at this point. And again, this is going to change as I actually get into implementing this. These are my initial thoughts. Now, timing on what a turn is. As you're reading a paragraph, it leads you to another one, that leads you to another one, that leads you to another one. Time is relative. Certain paragraphs will affect time or mark time. So you might start off with a move camp. So you go to the move camp, and there's going to be a number of random branching stories on moving the camp. Sometimes moving a camp could take weeks. Sometimes it's a matter of days. So depending on the actual branching of the story, certain paragraphs will have there'll be a marker on the paragraph that says this was 2 weeks, which will indicate marking of time will end a turn sequence. So as you're reading through these paragraphs, you'll just keep going. It'll all be part of this turn sequence until you get that marking of time, at which point you'll go back into the turn sequence. At least that's what I'm thinking right now. This is an example of my first story branch, and it's basically a supply drop, and it's starting to get branching out. I can only imagine if I design a couple dozen of these, this is going to have a lot of paragraphs. But we're going to try to get this one working as if this was the whole game. And if I can get my turn sequence and my events tables and everything working with this branch story, then it's just a matter of adding other narrative stories or branches and how they might interlink with each other, how they are unique. I really want to try to build in some replayability so that it's got some depth to this. So I'm really going to tackle this to create a very high quality choose your own adventure that's not just, and I know I'm not going to be able to do it on every paragraph. They're not all going to be novels. But I don't want, go to paragraph 3, and you show up on paragraph 3, and it says, roll a dice. On a 1 to 2, you defeat the orc. On a 5, 6, 7, or whatever, you run away. I want it to be a bit more engaging and include as much of the theater that I can for what the Coastwatchers were doing, and as accurate as I can when it comes to the history of it. As I flesh this out, and I don't want to give away any spoilers, if you decide that you want to play the game, I don't want to give you any spoilers, basically. I want you to be able to jump in and hopefully not know what's coming. And again, if I can build the replayability in. But on this generic stuff at this point, I don't have the story fleshed out. I'll share some of the choices so you can see, at least on this particular story branch. The other ones I'll keep secret. I can't do it all in a vacuum and not share some of what I'm doing. That kind of defeats the purpose of the series. Anyway, maybe next episode I'll dig into this a little deeper as I kind of flesh things out. So with that said, guys, that's kind of an update of where I'm at. I'm probably going to do a video when appropriate, but at least once every 2 weeks, just so you can see where I'm at with the process. Also, it kind of holds my feet to the fire to make sure I'm still working on it, which I have been, trust me. But it's nice to, be motivated sometimes to just say, hey, I got to get it done when you're maybe not feeling it. Anyway, as always, I appreciate you taking time to check out what we do on the channel here. Hopefully you're enjoying kind of the behind the scenes, at least how my brain works on the design of this. And like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow, and I appreciate it. And I'll talk to you in the next one. Goodbye for now.